Hey guys, tonight we meet a man who carried 12 complaints to a king who never asked to hear them. Justice, it seems, was a door that opened only when no one was knocking. Strange how the most important conversations happen in the spaces, between words, in the pauses where power decides whether to listen or simply wait for silence to return. Dim the lights now. Let your shoulders sink into whatever holds you tonight. Soft pillows, warm blankets, the familiar embrace of your favorite. Corner of the world, feel the weight of the day lifting like morning mist, leaving only this moment, this story, this gentle drift toward rest. Let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Are you tucked beneath blankets while rain taps against windows? Perhaps you're stealing these quiet minutes before dawn breaks, or maybe night has already claimed your corner of the world. Wherever you are, whenever this finds you, you're not alone in seeking the comfort of old stories told softly. Only if this calms you, only if these ancient voices feel like the right companions for tonight, let yourself settle deeper. There's no pressure here. No demands except the gentle invitation to drift alongside a man whose grievances were small earthquakes that only he could feel. In a kingdom where marble listened better than men, where power wore silk and justice counted coins, one citizen discovered that speaking truth to authority requires a particular kind of courage. The kind that doesn't expect to be rewarded, doesn't even expect to be heard, but speaks anyway because silence sometimes becomes its own form of surrender. Tonight, we'll walk with him through palace corridors that have heard 1,000 such stories and learned to keep their secrets. We'll stand where he stood, carry what he carried, and perhaps discover that the distance between citizen and crown is measured not in steps, but in the weight of words that dare to rise toward power. His name has been worn smooth by centuries, like stones in a riverbed, but his story remains sharp enough to cut through the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about justice, fairness, and the price of being heard in a world that profits from our silence. Come then, walk with me through gates that tower over hope like cathedral spires over prayer. Let his 12 grievances become a lullaby of sorts, not because injustice soothes, but because the courage to name it, to carry it forward despite the cost, creates its own quiet music. The palace sleeps fitfully tonight, as palaces do, when truth walks uninvited through their halls. But you can rest peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the space between his words and the king's silence, dignity found a way to survive, to endure, to whisper its own defiant lullaby across the centuries. Sleep comes easier, I think, when we remember that others before us have stood where we stand, carried what we carry, and chose to speak when speaking seemed impossible. Rest now, carrying that knowledge like a blanket woven from the courage of all who dared to believe that silence is not innocence, and that sometimes the most important victories are measured not in what changes, but in what refuses to surrender. You stand before gates taller than your fears, wider than your understanding of what justice might look like when it wears a crown. The iron bars rise like accusations against the evening sky, each one forged in furnaces that have never known the cold of your winter nights, the hunger of your empty harvest seasons. Evening light dies slowly here, as if reluctant to abandon you to whatever waits beyond these towering barriers. Torches begin their ancient dance along the palace walls, flames that flicker with the same nervous energy that courses through your chest. Each flame casts shadows that seem to lean toward you, as if even the light itself is curious about this small figure who dares approach power with empty hands and a heart full of grievances. The stone beneath your feet has been worn smooth by countless others who stood where you stand now. Merchants with proposals, nobles with complaints, citizens with hope that tasted like copper in their mouths. You can feel their presence in the worn grooves of the cobblestones, in the way the very air seems thick with the weight of unspoken words, unfulfilled promises, unanswered prayers. Your shadow grows longer as the sun surrenders to night, stretching behind you, like a dark echo of all the steps that brought you here. 2 days of walking, sleeping beneath stars that look down with what might have been pity or indifference. You could never quite tell which. Your feet know every stone of the road that leads to this moment, every rut and puddle that separates your village from this seat of power that governs your life from a distance measured not just in miles, but in understanding. Guards stand at attention with the stillness of men who have learned to see without watching, to hear without listening. Their armor catches the torchlight and throws it back in fragments, creating patterns of light and shadow that dance across their faces like masks. They have heard every possible complaint, every conceivable plea, every variation of desperate, hope dressed in formal language. To them, you are not a person with 12 specific grievances. You are simply another chapter in the endless book of human dissatisfaction that arrives at palace gates like predictable weather. The scent of frankincense drifts from somewhere within the palace walls, mingling with your fear sweat and the dust of your long journey. It's a sweet, heavy smell that speaks of ceremonies you'll never witness, of prayers offered in languages you don't understand, of a world that exists parallel to yours, but never quite touches it except in moments like these, when necessity forces the invisible to become visible. Cool stone meets your nervous palms as you steady yourself against the gate. The metal is so cold it almost burns, as if it has absorbed all the winter nights when your family huddled around fires built from furniture, because the firewood allocation never arrived. You can feel the vibration of the palace's hidden life through the iron, distant music, muffled conversations, the soft footfalls of servants who move like whispers through halls you'll never see. Footsteps approach from within, measured and deliberate. The vizier appears like a figure stepping out of a tapestry, silk robes rustling with the sound of secrets keeping themselves. His face is kind in the way that marble can be kind, beautiful, unchanging, and fundamentally unmoved by weather or time, or the small storms of human need that break against it daily. He nods to the guards, and you notice how even his smallest gestures carry the weight of absolute authority. This is a man who has never wondered if there will be food on his table tonight, never calculated whether the coins in his purse will stretch to cover both medicine and rent. His hands are soft in the way that comes from never having to grip anything more challenging than silk or silver. "You may enter," he says, and his voice carries the careful neutrality of someone who has delivered this same invitation 10,000 times. Neither welcoming nor forbidding, simply functional. The sound of a door opening that makes no promises about what waits on the other side. The gates swing open with a groan that seems to come from deep within the earth itself, as if the very foundations of the palace are sighing at the weight of yet another petition, yet another hope, yet another small rebellion against the natural order of things. The sound echoes off the palace walls and returns to you transformed, carrying undertones of all the other times these gates have opened for citizens, carrying grievances that tasted like metal and hope that felt like lead in their stomachs. As you step across the threshold, you feel something shift in the quality of the air itself. The world beyond these gates operates by different rules, speaks different languages, counts time in different currencies. Here, your 12 grievances become not personal tragedies, but administrative challenges, not moral imperatives, but bureaucratic, complications to be managed, filed, and eventually forgotten. Your footsteps sound different on palace stone, smaller somehow, as if the very architecture is designed to diminish the individual, to remind visitors of their proper scale in relation to power. Each step echoes and fades, creating a rhythm that matches your heartbeat. Hope and fear, hope and fear, hope and fear, until the two become indistinguishable. The vizier walks ahead of you, and you notice how his shadow moves with liquid grace across walls decorated with tapestries that cost more than your village sees in a year. His pace is unhurried but purposeful, the walk of someone who knows exactly where he's going and has all the time in the world to get there. For you, each step is a small act of courage. For him, it's simply Tuesday. Behind you, the gates swing, shut with a finality that seems to separate not just you from the outside world, but past from present, citizen from subject, the person you were an hour ago from whoever you're becoming in this procession toward power. The sound reverberates through your chest like a bell tolling, marking time in a measurement you don't yet understand. The vizier nods, not kindly, not unkindly, simply the way water nods to stone before wearing it away, grain by grain, century by century. His acknowledgement carries no emotion, no judgment, no promise of outcome. It simply confirms that you exist, that you have crossed the threshold, that you are now part of the palace's careful machinery of listening without hearing, of processing without changing, of receiving petitions without necessarily granting justice. Ahead lies the throne room, where 12 grievances will meet one crown, where your small voice will rise toward marble walls that have heard everything and learned to forget most of it. But first, this corridor, these tapestries, this slow walk toward a conversation that will change nothing and everything, depending on how you measure victory in a kingdom where silence masquerades as wisdom and patience disguises itself as justice. Thirst teaches patience, they say, but patience, you've learned, tastes like dust and sounds like empty promises echoing in dry wells that gave up their secrets long before you arrived with your bucket and your hope. 2 summers ago, the district governor stood in your village, square beneath a sun that beat down like a brass hammer on anvil stone. His silk robes caught the light and threw it back in ways that hurt to look at directly, as if prosperity itself was too bright for eyes accustomed to the muted colors of want. He spoke of clean water that would flow to your quarter by autumn, pipes that would carry the gift of life from springs high in the mountains, where snow never quite melted and streams sang songs your children had never heard. The crowd gathered, like flowers turning towards sunlight, faces lifted with the particular hope that comes only to those who have known real thirst. Women who had boiled water 3 times and still found sediment like guilt at the bottom of their cups. Men who had watched their children grow thin on liquid that tasted of rust and carried the weight of old regrets. Everyone believing, for that golden moment, that promises made in silk were somehow more substantial than promises made in homespun wool. Your daughter's fever lasted through that winter, burning hot in the small hours when the world felt most fragile, and your prayers most desperate. Water that had to be boiled and boiled again until it became something closer to steam than substance, until it carried more heat than nourishment, until the very act of making it safe seemed to drain away whatever healing it might have offered. She recovered, as children do when they have no choice but to recover, but something in her eyes spoke of battles fought and won at costs you would never fully understand. The cruel irony lives in the night sounds that drift from the palace district, fountains that sing their liquid lullabies, while your neighborhood whispers prayers for rain that never comes, or comes too late, or comes in floods that wash away more than they nourish. Those fountain songs carry on the wind like mockery dressed as music, like abundance performing for an audience of scarcity. You learn to time your nights by the sound of that distant water, the way sailors learn to read stars. Midnight brought the soft splash of ornamental cascades where marble dolphins played eternal games with liquid silver. Dawn carried the gentle murmur of courtyard streams that had never known drought, never tasted the bitter minerals of desperation, never carried the weight of a mother's worry or a father's shame. The wells in your quarter gave up only rust and regret, water that left stains on everything it touched. Clothes, skin, hope. You learned to read the color of what came up from those depths. Brown meant iron, green meant sickness, clear meant miracle, but usually meant mistake. Your neighbors developed rituals around water collection, small prayers, and careful measurements that turned necessity into ceremony, as if the proper reverence might coax better fortune from pipes that ran empty more often than full. Your complaint flows like the water that never came, slowly, with great effort, carrying sediment of older griefs. Each word you plan to speak to the king tastes of metal and disappointment, seasoned with the salt of tears your wife cried when she thought you were sleeping. The language of thirst becomes a dialect you never wanted to learn, with vocabulary. That includes the sound of empty buckets scraping stone, the weight of ceramic jugs that mock you with their hollowness, the particular silence that falls over a house where children ask for drinks and receive apologies instead. In your dreams, water runs clear and cold and endless. In your dreams, fountains sing in your own courtyard, while your children splash and laugh with the abandon that comes only to those who have never known want. You wake from these dreams with the taste of phantom streams on your tongue, with the echo of liquid music in your ears, with the memory of abundance that feels more real than the empty pitcher beside your bed. The governor's autumn deadline came and went like all the seasons that had preceded it, marked more by hope deferred than by changes in weather. The pipes he promised remained buried in planning documents that lived in offices you had never seen, signed by officials whose names you couldn't pronounce, approved by committees that met in rooms where clean water flowed from silver taps into basins carved from stone that cost more than your house. Your water still tastes of the earth's reluctance to give up its secrets, of minerals that speak of deep places where no sunlight reaches, of underground rivers that flow beneath other people's, land toward other people's fountains. Each morning brings the same careful rationing, the same hopeful examination of what rises from wells that seem to grow more reluctant with each passing season. Yet somehow, in the careful measuring and patient boiling, in the daily ritual of making inadequate water serve life's basic needs, your family found rhythms that carried their own quiet music. Your daughter learned to savor each sip like communion wine. Your wife developed recipes that transformed scarcity into sustenance, that made thin soup taste like abundance through the alchemy of love and necessity. The fountains still sing their night songs in the palace district, indifferent to the irony of their abundance. But your complaint carries forward, shaped by the weight of empty buckets and the sound of children who learned too early that not all thirsts can be quenched, that some promises evaporate like morning dew before they can take root in the soil of possibility. Water should flow like justice, clear, consistent, available to all who need it. Instead, it pools in places where gold runs deepest, where power ensures that abundance serves only those who already have enough. Your first complaint tastes like metal in your mouth, carries the weight of wells that remember better times, flows toward a throne where fountains sing, and a king who has never known the particular silence of an empty cup. But water, you think, walking deeper into the palace, water is only the first complaint. Deeper currents run beneath, carrying grievances that have learned to flow uphill, toward power, toward the possibility that someone, somewhere, might finally choose to listen to the music of need over the comfortable silence of indifference. Gold has a way of disappearing, you've discovered. especially when it was never quite yours to begin with. When it lived in your purse only temporarily, like a guest who knows they're not welcome, but stays anyway until someone with greater authority demands their removal. The tax collectors arrived. First in spring, when hope still tasted sweet and your small garden promised abundance that might, this year finally, exceed mere survival. They came with ledgers bound in leather that had never known want, with scales that weighed more than precision. They weighed the mathematics of power, the careful calculation of how much can be taken without killing the source entirely. Their leader spoke with the careful articulation of someone educated in the art of making theft sound like civic duty. Assessment, he called it, examining your modest holdings with eyes that catalogued everything. The copper pot that had belonged to your grandmother, the wooden chest where you kept your few valuables, the small store of grain that represented the difference between winter comfort and winter endurance. His assistant made notes in handwriting that looked like art compared to your own careful scratches. You paid, as citizens do when citizens have no choice but to be citizens. The gold left your hands with the finality of seasons changing, flowing upward toward authorities who needed it more than you needed food, shelter, or the simple security of knowing tomorrow's bread was already secured. The receipt they provided was written in language that felt foreign, even though you recognized most of the words. Official phrases that transformed your gold into their right, your payment into their due. Autumn brought the same men with the same ledgers, but now they wore expressions of patient disappointment, as if your spring payment had been merely a down payment on obligations you had never fully understood. The spring visit was merely assessment, they explained with the tired patience of teachers correcting slow students. This is the actual collection. The absurdity of it tasted like copper pennies held too long in your mouth. You had been taxed for the privilege of being assessed for taxation, charged for the service of having your holdings measured for the purpose of determining how much could be taken. It was mathematical poetry of the cruelest sort. Numbers that danced in circles, ledgers that bred obligations like mice in granaries, calculations that always resolved in favor of those who held the scales. Your son's apprenticeship dissolved like sugar in rain. The silversmith had been willing to take him on for a fee that would have stretched your resources, but remained within the realm of possibility. Now that same fee lived in tax collectors' purses, transformed from investment in your child's future into fuel for someone else's present comfort. Your boy returned to helping in your small plot, his hands learning soil instead of silver, his future narrowing to the width of rows he could plant and tend. Your wife's wedding ring made its own journey to the tax collector's scales, not directly, but through the alchemy of necessity. The ring became coins. The coins became bread when the larder grew thin. The bread became sustenance that carried. Your family through weeks when tax obligations left insufficient resources for both civic duty and survival. She never spoke of its absence, but her hands told the story, in the way they unconsciously turned the band that was no longer there. The ledgers showed your spring payment as pending, not received, not credited, but suspended in the bureaucratic limbo that exists between acknowledgement and acceptance. Official records that transformed your actual payment into theoretical obligation, your completed duty into incomplete responsibility. You learned that gold, once given to tax collectors, becomes as malleable as the metal itself, shaped by official need into whatever form best serves official purposes. They taxed you for windows you didn't have in a house that faced the wrong direction to benefit from them. They taxed you for access to roads that stopped 3 miles short of your door, for protection provided by soldiers you had never seen, for services rendered by officials whose names you didn't know, for problems you had never encountered. Each line item in their ledgers represented someone else's imagination of what your life required. someone else's calculation of what your existence owed to their administration. The mathematics of exploitation follows laws more reliable than those, governing seasons or weather, take precisely enough to cause hardship, but not revolution, extract exactly sufficient to generate complaint, but not rebellion, calibrate the pressure so that citizens bend without breaking, yield without fleeing, pay without having enough left, over to organize resistance. Your complaint against double taxation carries the weight of silver that learned to flow uphill, coins that developed the ability to be in two places simultaneously, taken and owed, paid and pending, satisfied and insufficient all at once. The language of fiscal responsibility becomes dialect spoken fluently by those who take and incomprehension by those who give. Tax collectors are harvest reapers who never planted seeds, fishermen who never stocked ponds, merchants who never risked capital. They arrive with the certainty of men who understand that necessity makes citizens cooperative, that survival requires collaboration with one's own exploitation, that families will pay any price to avoid consequences they can imagine all too clearly. You learn to read the seasonality of official greed: spring for assessment, autumn for collection, winter for penalties, summer for the additional levies that arise from emergency circumstances that seem remarkably regular in their irregularity. Each season brought men with ledgers and explanations, with scales and justifications, with the patient condescension of those who transform taking into teaching moments about civic responsibility. The truly bitter discovery was not the double taxation itself, but the realization that your outrage was exactly as expected and precisely as irrelevant as your tax collectors' training had prepared them to handle. Your anger was another line item in their ledgers, another predictable response they had been equipped to deflect with phrases about shared sacrifice and civic duty, and the greater good that somehow never seemed to include your own good or your family's welfare. Still, gold can be earned again, you tell yourself as you walk deeper into the palace corridors. Coins can be replaced through labor and luck and the patient accumulation of small abundances. But trust, you've learned, heals differently than purse strings. Trust, once broken by the mathematics of systematic theft, mends like bone, stronger, in the broken places perhaps, but never quite straight, never quite the same shape it held before it learned what forces were prepared to break it. Your second complaint tastes of metal and disappointment, carries the weight of ledgers that lie with official precision, flows toward a throne where those who collect have never known the particular pain of being collected from, where power counts different currencies than those recognized by the powerless, who fund its operations. A daughter's future weighs exactly 17 silver pieces. You had calculated over 8 careful years of counting and saving and dreaming. Or it did, before the magistrate's son decided that silver flows better toward gambling tables than toward the quiet ceremonies that transform girls into wives, hope into security, possibilities into the promise of grandchildren who might know better fortune than their grandparents. Each coin had its own story, its own small sacrifice that made its way into the wooden box you kept beneath loose floorboards, that creaked like secrets whenever you checked your growing treasure. The silver piece from selling your father's tools after his funeral, tools that had shaped wood into useful things, that had carried the weight of his hands and the memory of his patient teaching. The coins saved from harvest seasons when the weather cooperated and your small plots yielded more than mere survival, abundance that tasted like possibility. Your daughter knew about the dowry in the way children know about presents wrapped and hidden weeks before celebrations. Not the specific details, but the shape of love that plans ahead, that counts coins by candlelight, that transforms daily privation into future security through the patient mathematics of sacrifice. She would catch you sometimes counting the silver, and her smile carried the particular warmth that comes to those who understand they are cherished enough to be planned for. 8 years of coins accumulating like prayers, answered in small denominations, silver pieces that represented meals simplified, clothes mended instead of replaced, luxuries foregone so that your daughter's tomorrow might hold choices your own youth had never offered. Each addition to the dowry box was celebration and commitment, proof that love could be measured in metal, that hope could be hoarded like grain against lean seasons. The magistrate's son developed expensive tastes in cards and dice and the sort of companions who encourage young men with more enthusiasm than sense to wager money they don't possess on outcomes they can't control. His losses accumulated like snow in winter, slowly at first, then with the dangerous speed that transforms landscapes overnight, that buries familiar landmarks under blankets of white that all look identical to eyes that no longer recognize the terrain they thought they knew. Official papers appeared with the sudden inevitability of weather systems that form beyond your vision and arrive without warning. Documents claiming debts your family had never incurred, obligations you had never assumed, responsibilities that seemed to have materialized from the intersection of official imagination and legal necessity. The language was precise in the way that laws are precise, every word carefully chosen to mean exactly what power needs it to mean, and nothing that subjects might prefer it to mean instead. The seizure happened with bureaucratic efficiency that transformed theft into legal procedure, want into administrative necessity, your daughter's future into someone else's present convenience. Men arrived with authority that outweighed your ownership, with papers that superseded your possession, with the patient explanations of those who have learned to make injustice sound like unfortunate necessity rather than calculated cruelty. Your daughter's tears tasted like years of sacrifice transformed into salt, like silver coins melted down and reformed into drops of grief that carried the metallic flavor of dreams deferred, possibilities foreclosed, choices that would now be made by necessity rather than selected from abundance. She cried with the particular devastation of children who discover that adults can lie not just with words but with systems, not just through speech but through institutions that promise protection while practicing predation. 17 silver pieces became 17 pieces of evidence in a legal proceeding that existed only on paper, that generated conclusions without requiring witnesses, that produced judgments without allowing arguments. Your silver was transformed through bureaucratic alchemy into payment for debts you had never contracted, compensation for damages you had never caused, settlement for claims you had never heard until they were already resolved against you. The magistrates signed papers with ink that cost more than silver, with pens crafted from materials your hands had never touched, in offices decorated with tapestries that depicted justice as a blindfolded woman, holding scales that somehow always balanced in favor of those who owned the most weights. His signature transformed your accumulation into his son's salvation, your daughter's security into gambling debt resolution, private savings into public service rendered to those who served themselves most efficiently. You learned the legal language of loss, how silver becomes available assets, how dowries become liquid resources, how your daughter's planned wedding becomes deferred due to changed financial circumstances. The vocabulary of dispossession speaks in passive voice, as if 17 silver pieces simply decided to leave your possession, rather than being taken by specific people for specific purposes that served specific interests opposed to your own. The broader lesson tasted more bitter than the specific loss. Your daughter's dowry had disappeared not through misfortune or accident, or the random cruelties that sometimes befall careful planners, but through the systematic operation of institutions designed to ensure that silver flows uphill, that abundance concentrates among those who already possess abundance, that the patient savings of the poor become emergency resources for the improvident rich. Your daughter adapted with the resilience of young people who learn early that life requires frequent recalculation of expectations, rapid adjustment to circumstances that adults create and children inherit. She spoke less of marriage plans and more of learning trades that might provide independence, of skills that couldn't be seized by magistrates or transformed into gambling debt payments, of capabilities that belonged to her hands and mind rather than to wooden boxes hidden beneath floorboards. The magistrate's son continued his education in cards and dice with resources that had once represented your family's hopes, transformed into his family's solutions. Your 17 silver pieces became chips in games you would never see, wagered on outcomes that would never affect your life except in their absence, spent in establishments where your name would never be mentioned and your daughter's sacrifice would never be acknowledged. Silver, you discovered, possesses memory, not the kind that remembers where it came from or who sacrificed to accumulate it, but the kind that remembers only its current owner, only its present purpose, only the immediate desires of those whose hands currently direct its movement. Your years of saving became invisible to metal that knew only its new service, only its current function as fuel for appetites you had never shared and consequences you were forced to absorb. Your third complaint carries the weight of 17 silver pieces that learned to forget their origin, that transformed love into loss through legal procedures that operate with the efficiency of mills grinding grain, taking whatever is fed into them and producing whatever serves those who own the machinery. It flows toward a throne where justice weighs different scales than those used by magistrates, where power might remember that silver pieces represent more than their metal value, that dowries carry the dreams of families who count coins by candlelight and measure hope in small denominations accumulated through sacrifice. Still, silver can be replaced, you tell yourself, though slowly, though with difficulty that increases each year as your back grows more reluctant and your opportunities more limited. But trust, once broken by the discovery that legal systems serve those who design them rather than those who rely on them, heals like trust always heals, incompletely, cautiously, with scar tissue that remembers exactly how the original wound was inflicted and remains forever sensitive to similar pressures. Hunger, you've discovered, makes philosophers of us all. Empty bellies ask the hardest questions about abundance and scarcity, about systems that create famine from plenty, about the particular mathematics that transform surplus into shortage through the simple expedient of storing wealth where it serves power rather than where it feeds people. The promise arrived with autumn's first cool breath, carried by officials who spoke of public granaries with the enthusiasm of merchants describing profitable ventures. Government warehouses would store your harvest surplus at fair prices, they explained, protecting your grain from the uncertainties of weather and vermin, while guaranteeing you steady income and your community reliable food supplies during the lean months when fields lay fallow and families counted meals like prayers. Your grain made its journey to the storage facilities with the hope that accompanies all surrendering of immediate control for promised future benefit. Sacks of wheat and barley that represented months of labor, seed carefully selected and soil lovingly prepared, and crops tended through the patient seasons of growth. Each grain carried the memory of your hands, the weight of early mornings and late evenings, the accumulated prayers of a family that understood how many steps separate planting from eating. The granaries themselves were impressive structures, stone, buildings that spoke of permanence and official commitment, designed to protect grain from all the hazards that threaten stored food, raised floors to discourage rodents, ventilation systems to prevent moisture, careful organization that promised efficient distribution when winter's hunger made food more precious than gold. Your grain disappeared into these fortress-like structures, with the finality of letters posted to distant relatives. The first signs of trouble arrived with the smell, sweet and sick, the distinctive odor of grain transforming itself from sustenance into soil, from food into the sort of organic matter that feeds mold rather than families. Officials explained that moisture had somehow penetrated the storage systems, that unseasonable rains had created conditions they had not anticipated, that the spoilage was an unfortunate consequence of weather patterns beyond anyone's control. But the grain that rotted in government warehouses was yours and your neighbors'. The grain contributed by farmers who had trusted official promises about proper storage and fair distribution. The grain that remained sound, that survived the mysterious moisture problems, had somehow been purchased from different sources and sold to merchants who paid prices that reflected scarcity, rather than the abundance that should have existed. If storage systems had protected all grain equally, winter taught you the bitter arithmetic of systematized hunger. You found yourself purchasing bread made from your own wheat, buying back your own grain at prices that reflected its new scarcity, paying 3 times what you had received for storage fees that had apparently funded not preservation but the careful selection of which grain would survive and which would be allowed to rot in service of someone else's profit margins. The officials who had promised protection became experts in explanation. They spoke of unprecedented weather conditions, of storage challenges that exceeded their engineering capabilities, of the unfortunate convergence of factors that no reasonable planning could have anticipated. Their explanations carried the mathematical precision of those who had calculated exactly how much loss would be acceptable to those who lost, and how much gain would be optimal for those who gained. Your grain had been transformed through bureaucratic alchemy, from abundance into scarcity, from security into vulnerability, from the harvest that should have carried your family through winter into the hunger that defined your family's winter experience. The smell of mouldering wheat became the olfactory signature of your 4th complaint, the sensory memory that would forever associate official promises with the sweet sick odor of abundance allowed to rot while people starved. The broader pattern revealed itself like dawn breaking over familiar landscape made strange by changed light. The grain that survived storage had been purchased from farmers who owned larger plots, who possessed political connections, who understood which officials required which considerations to ensure their harvests received adequate protection from moisture problems that seemed to affect storage selectively rather than universally. You learned to read the seasonality of systematic hunger, autumn for promises of protection, winter for discoveries of spoilage, spring for explanations of forces beyond official control, summer for new promises that next year's storage would benefit from lessons learned through this year's unfortunate experiences. Each season brought men with reassurances and justifications, with condolences and commitments to improved procedures that would prevent future occurrences of problems that seemed remarkably consistent in their inconsistency. The hollow sound of empty storage jars in your own home became counterpoint to the sweet sick smell that drifted from official granaries, where your grain continued its transformation from food into fertilizer. Your family learned to ration bread with the precision of apothecaries measuring medicine, making each loaf last until the next could be obtained, stretching meals like musicians stretching songs to fill empty spaces that threatened to overwhelm, rhythm with silence. Your wife developed recipes that transformed scarcity into sustenance through the patient alchemy of love and creativity. Thin soups that carried the memory of abundance, bread stretched with ingredients that had never been designed for human consumption, but could be rendered edible through determination and necessity. She learned to make want taste like choice, to transform inadequacy into variety through the magic of refusing to surrender hope to circumstances. The weight of bread rationed to last until morning became the physical manifestation of your fourth complaint, the way hunger concentrates. The mind wonderfully, as philosophers say, creating clarity about what matters most and what matters least, about which systems serve people and which systems serve themselves while requiring people to serve them in return. Grain, you realized, possesses its own political economy. It flows toward those who can protect it from rot, who can ensure its preservation serves their interests rather than being sacrificed to the broader needs of communities who trusted its protection to institutions that protected some grain while allowing other grain to teach lessons about the consequences of trusting protection to those who profit from selective preservation. Your complaint carries the sweet, sick smell of abundance transformed into scarcity through official neglect that was indistinguishable from official policy, through storage problems that affected only grain owned by those who lacked power to ensure their grain received the same protection accorded to grain owned by those who possessed such power. It flows toward a throne where hunger is theoretical rather than experiential, where abundance never rots because abundance never lacks adequate protection. But grain, at least, grows again with new seasons. You remind yourself as you walk deeper into palace corridors where the air carries no hint of rot, where abundance is assumed rather than achieved through careful planning and patient sacrifice. Some harvests, you've learned, are reaped only once. Trust, security, the faith that systems designed to serve will actually serve rather than serve themselves, while explaining why such service requires that others be served less adequately or not at all. They built a road to your district. It ended 3 miles short of arriving, like a sentence abandoned mid-thought, like a promise that lost interest in its own completion somewhere between conception and delivery. The announcement arrived with spring's first warm days, carried by engineers who spoke of imperial road projects with the enthusiasm of children describing birthday wishes they believed would certainly come true. Connecting rural districts to markets, they explained, drawing maps in the dirt with sticks that had never known the weight of real labor. Your village would be linked to the great commercial arteries that carried wealth and goods and possibilities between cities you had heard of but never seen. The engineering was impressive in its precision and ambition. Stone markers appeared along the planned route like promises carved in granite, each one precisely placed according to calculations that accounted for grade and drainage and the efficient movement of carts carrying products from your district to markets that would surely pay fair prices for goods that could finally arrive fresh rather than spoiled by the long journey over paths that disappeared in mud season and became impassable when winter arrived with its annual burden of snow and isolation. Work crews arrived with the systematic efficiency of ants, equipped with tools that gleamed like jewelry, and knowledge that transformed raw landscape into smooth passage. You watched them lay foundation stones with the care of craftsmen who understood that roads, once built properly, would serve generations of travelers who would never know the names of those who made their journeys possible. The road grew toward your village-like hope made manifest in stone and packed earth. Each day brought visible progress, bridges that spanned streams which had previously required careful navigation, embankments that raised the roadway above seasonal flooding, culverts that channeled water away from surfaces designed to remain solid regardless of weather's attempts to undermine human engineering, with natural processes that respected no political boundaries. Your cartwheels learned to anticipate the daily pleasure of smooth passage over surfaces that had been designed, rather than discovered, engineered rather than worn into existence by the accumulated passage of countless others who had shared your need to move goods from where they were produced to where they might be sold. The road promised liberation from the seasonal isolation that cut your community off from commerce for months at a time. 3 miles from your village, the road ended with the abruptness of conversation interrupted by death. Not gradually, not with diminishing quality that suggested insufficient resources, but completely. Finished stone, giving way to familiar mud and ruts, as if the two surfaces belonged to different centuries, different civilizations, different understandings of what transportation could be when properly funded and adequately planned. The explanation arrived with the same precision that had characterized the original promises. Imperial funding had been redirected to more pressing needs, they announced, though they didn't specify which needs had proven more pressing than connecting productive agricultural districts to markets that would benefit both farmers and urban populations who required fresh food. The road project had been completed as designed, they insisted, though the design apparently ended precisely where it ended, 3 miles short of your village, at the estate of the provincial governor's brother. You learned to read the political geography written in stone and absence of stone. The road that served the governor's brother's estate had been completed with marble markers and decorative elements that transformed functional transportation into artistic statement. Bridges over his streams featured carved figures and architectural flourishes that spoke of budgets unconstrained by practical necessity, of engineering projects that served aesthetic as well as commercial purposes. Your goods continued their ancient journey over paths that knew every season's particular challenges, every weather pattern's specific obstacles to commerce. Your cartwheels developed intimate knowledge of ruts that deepened each year, stones that shifted with freeze and thaw, mud that turned traveling into gambling where successful passage depended more on luck than planning, more on weather than skill. The final 3 miles became the physical manifestation of distance between citizen and power, the measurable gap between promise and performance, the space where good intentions revealed their true priorities through the simple expedient of examining where money was actually spent rather than where it was theoretically allocated. 3 miles that might as well have been 300, 3,000, 3 continents, for all the connection they provided between your district and the commercial opportunities that lay just beyond your reach. Markets that should have received your goods fresh instead received them spoiled, bruised by the journey over surfaces that treated commerce like obstacle course rather than facilitated exchange. Produce that began journey as abundance arrived as damaged goods, suitable only for animal feed or compost, transformed by inadequate transportation from profit into loss, from success into frustration, from connection into isolation. Your complaint against incomplete infrastructure carries the weight of cartwheels that know every stone, every rut, every place where hope gets stuck in mud that never quite dries because drainage was never quite completed. It measures the distance between marble boulevards in the capital and missing connections in rural districts, between roads that lead to palaces and roads that stop at your dreams like sentences that lose interest in their own completion. The provincial governor's brother never experienced the particular disappointment of roads that promise connection and deliver isolation. His estate flourished with the commercial advantages provided by infrastructure that connected his production to markets that paid prices reflecting goods that arrived undamaged, unspoiled, competitive, with products from regions that had been blessed with completed transportation rather than abandoned halfway to adequacy. You learned that road construction follows laws more predictable than those governing weather or seasons. Stone flows toward those who possess power to ensure completion. Engineering serves those who can guarantee that projects begun in their interest will be finished according to original specifications rather than abandoned when funding discovers more pressing priorities that coincidentally serve more politically influential constituencies. The truly bitter lesson was not the incomplete road itself, but the discovery that 3 miles of missing connection could negate the value of all the miles that had been completed. A road to nowhere is worse than no road at all, because it represents hope systematically cultivated and then systematically betrayed, because it demonstrates the infrastructure of disappointment disguised as the infrastructure of progress. Your cart developed its own philosophy about surfaces that promise smooth passage and deliver familiar obstacles. Wheels learn to expect disappointment, to prepare for the moment when engineering gives way to neglect, when promise surrenders to political reality, when the road that leads toward possibilities suddenly ends at the boundary between what power provides for itself and what power provides for those who lack power to ensure completion. Miles can be walked, though slowly. You remind yourself as palace corridors stretch ahead with their promise of eventual audience with authority that might possibly understand that roads serve their purpose only when they actually reach their destinations rather than stopping wherever political convenience suggests they should stop. Distance, you're learning, is measured in more than steps. It's measured in the space between promise and performance, between what is announced and what is delivered, between the roads that serve power and the roads that would serve people if power chose to complete them. Justice, you've observed, dresses better than those who need it most. It wears silk that costs more than villages see in seasons, jewelry that catches light and throws it back in patterns that blind observers to everything except their own inadequacy when measured against such magnificence. The court case began with your neighbour's land dispute, a simple matter of boundaries that had been recognised by custom for generations until custom encountered legal interpretation that favoured written documentation over lived experience, official surveys over the testimony of those who had worked soil with their own hands and knew its character through seasons of planting and harvesting and resting. Your neighbour had farmed the disputed plot for 20 years, turning rocky ground into productive earth through the patient application of labour and love, and the sort of intimate knowledge that comes only to those who spend their lives in conversation with specific soil, specific weather patterns, specific relationships between seed and season that cannot be learned from books or measured by instruments that have never felt frost or known drought. The wealthy merchant who claimed ownership arrived with documents that gleamed like his silk robes, papers bearing seals that spoke of official authority and legal precedent, and the sort of documentation that exists independent of physical reality, that creates truth through the simple expedient of being written down by those whose writing carries the weight of law rather than merely the weight of experience. The magistrate who heard the case wore robes that rustled with the sound of prosperity, silk that whispered secrets about salaries that never knew uncertainty, about security that never questioned where tomorrow's bread would originate. His court was appointed with furnishings that spoke of budgets unconstrained by practical necessity, of justice that could afford to be beautiful, because beauty, apparently, enhanced the dignity of legal proceedings. The hearing itself lasted precisely long enough for the magistrate to examine documents that supported the merchant's claim, while declining to hear testimony that supported your neighbour's 20 years of actual cultivation, actual improvement, actual relationship with land that knew his touch and responded to his care in ways that no document could capture or convey to audiences who preferred paper evidence to living witness. Your neighbour's hands told their own story, calloused by tools, stained by soil, marked by the accumulated small injuries that come to those who work with growing things that sometimes resist cultivation, that require patience and persistence, and the sort of stubborn hope that, plants seeds even when harvest seems uncertain. His hands had shaped the disputed land as surely as the land had shaped his hands, creating a relationship that legal documents could not replicate or replace. The magistrate's hands, by contrast, knew only the weight of pens that cost more than plowshares, the texture of papers smoother than any soil, the comfortable certainty of those who make decisions about land they will never work, crops they will never plant, harvests they will never gather, except through the indirect mechanism of legal fees and court costs that transform justice into profitable enterprise. The ruling arrived with the finality of weather systems that form beyond human influence and descend with consequences that must be endured rather than negotiated. 20 years of cultivation became irrelevant in the face of documents that predated cultivation, papers that claimed authority over reality through the simple expedient of having been written by those whose writing was accepted as more reliable than the testimony of those who had lived the reality the documents claimed to describe. Your neighbor's eviction proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that transformed his life's work into trespass, his intimate knowledge of soil and season into irrelevant opinion, his 20 years of improvement into unauthorized modification of property that belonged to others, regardless of who had performed the work of making it productive. Justice wore silk, while he wore the clothes of those who work with their hands. And silk apparently spoke a language that courts understood better than the vocabulary of labor. The broader pattern revealed itself like sunrise illuminating landscape that had been hidden by darkness. Justice flowed toward those who could afford to dress appropriately for court appearances, who could speak the language that legal proceedings recognized as authoritative, who possessed documentation that courts accepted as more reliable than the lived experience of those who lacked proper papers but possessed intimate knowledge of the realities that papers claimed to govern. The merchant never visited the land he had won through legal procedure. It became another entry in ledgers that catalogued possessions rather than relationships, another asset that generated income through mechanisms that required no personal knowledge of soil or season, or the patient work of cultivation that transforms possibility into productivity. His ownership was theoretical, administrative, profitable in ways that required no understanding of what was actually owned. Your neighbor found work as a day laborer on the land he had once owned through use and improvement, hired by overseers who worked for the merchant who had never seen the soil that generated his new income. The irony tasted like metal in your mouth. Justice that transformed owner into employee, cultivator into hired hand, 20 years of relationship into daily wages paid for work he had once performed for his own benefit. The precedent established by this ruling affected property rights throughout your district in ways that legal minds had calculated, but rural communities had not anticipated. Customary ownership based on use and improvement became vulnerable to legal challenge by those who possessed proper documentation, who could afford proper representation, who understood that justice favored those who spoke its language fluently over those who merely lived its consequences daily. You learned to read the architecture of legal proceedings designed to serve those who could afford architectural consultation. Courtrooms built to intimidate rather than welcome. Procedures designed to favor those familiar with procedural requirements. Language that excluded rather than included those whose lives would be affected by legal decisions made in their absence or despite their presence. Your complaint against silk-clad justice carries the weight of gavels that fall like axes on hope. The sound of decisions that echo in marble halls while families pack belongings and search for new places to live, new ways to survive the transformation of their lives into legal precedents that serve interests they will never share or benefit from understanding. Justice, you think as you walk deeper into palace corridors, where silk is assumed rather than admired, where power dresses appropriately for every occasion because power can afford appropriate dress for any circumstance, should be blind to the cost of clothing worn by those who seek its attention. Instead, it seems to see most clearly those who dress it in gold, who ornament it with gifts that ensure their cases are heard with the sort of attention that silk commands and homespun never receives. Silk, you've concluded, makes a poor blindfold for justice. It's too thin to hide what everyone can see, too expensive to be worn by those who most need justice, to be blind to everything except truth, too beautiful to be trusted with decisions that affect the lives of those who will never own silk, but must live with the consequences of justice that prefers silk to truth, appearance to reality, documentation to the lived experience of those whose lives become footnotes in legal decisions made by those who will never live. The footnotes they create. Ignorance, the officials said, was a choice. They forgot to mention who was doing the choosing. You remember the morning when the Imperial Herald arrived in your district, his voice carrying promises like seeds on the wind. Within 5 years, he announced, his words echoing off the adobe walls of your modest homes, every child in the Empire will learn to read. Knowledge shall flow like water to every corner of our great realm. 5 years. You counted them on fingers worn smooth by honest labor, watching as each season brought new disappointments wrapped in bureaucratic explanations. The schools were built, yes, magnificent structures of marble and cedar that rose like temples in the wealthy quarters of the capital. You could see their spires glinting in the distance when you climbed the highest hill near your village, those towers of learning, standing like accusations against the empty lot where your own school was supposed to bloom. Your son's mind burns bright as summer lightning. At 8 years old, he already reads the grain sacks that come from distant provinces, sounding out syllables like a scholar deciphering ancient texts. His finger traces letters carved into market stones, his eyes hungry for words the way other. Children hunger for honey cakes, but hunger, you've learned, is not enough when the feast is served only at tables you cannot reach. The local merchant's son travels 30 miles each morning to attend the marble school. His father's cart rumbles past your door before dawn, wheels turning toward opportunities that gold can purchase. Your son watches from the window, his breath fogging the glass as he counts the books stacked in the cart's bed. More stories than your family has ever owned, more knowledge than your district has ever seen. When you petitioned for a traveling teacher, the response came written in script so elaborate that half the village couldn't read it. Budget allocations, it explained, must be distributed according to population density and economic viability. Your translator, the old scribe who charges 2 copper coins per page, read it aloud in the market square. The words tasted like dust in the morning air, technical language that dressed simple refusal in the silk of official necessity. The cruel mathematics of education revealed themselves slowly, like frost patterns forming on winter windows. Literacy tests for citizenship, they announced, would ensure that only informed citizens participated in governance. Yet the same system that demanded reading ability for civic participation was the system that kept books locked away in marble, towers, guarded by fees that cost more than your family's yearly earnings. Your daughter, quick with numbers and quicker still with questions, counts coins by candlelight, calculating how many years of saved meals it would take to buy her brother passage to the distant school. Her arithmetic becomes philosophy as she realizes that education, like water, flows downhill toward those who already have enough. The weight of her understanding settles on her shoulders like a cloak too heavy for her age. In the evenings, you teach what you can by firelight. Letters scratched in dirt floors, numbers counted on fingers that know the weight of honest work. Your children learn that A looks like a mountain peak, that B stands balanced like a merchant's scale. But these small victories taste bittersweet when you know that real learning, the kind that opens doors and changes destinies, remains locked behind gates your children may never pass through. The village elder, whose beard holds the silver of 70 winters, speaks of the old days when knowledge lived in stories rather than books. But even he understands that the world has changed, that power now speaks in written words rather than whispered wisdom. His own grandchildren sit in the front row when you teach letters by lamplight, their young faces serious with the weight of dreams that may never find paper. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, you wonder if ignorance truly is a choice. But as you watch your son trace letters in the morning frost on your window, as you see your daughter calculating impossible sums of hope and opportunity, you know the choice was never yours to make. The choosing belongs to those who build marble schools on distant hills, who write policies in script too ornate for common eyes to read. Words, you've learned, have weight, especially the ones your children will never read, the stories they'll never hold, the knowledge that flows like a river just beyond their reach. But in the darkness before sleep, you hold on to the smaller truth, that wisdom lives not only in books, but in the careful way you teach your children to read the world around them. One letter, one lesson, one act of quiet rebellion at a time. Health, like happiness, becomes precious only when it's priced beyond reach. Your mother's cough began like whispers, soft sounds in the night that spoke of autumn settling in her chest. By winter's heart, those whispers had become declarations that rattled the walls of your small house and shook the foundations of your carefully budgeted life. Sleep fled from your family like birds before a storm, leaving you all hollow-eyed and listening for the pauses between her labored breaths that might mean the worst had finally come. The imperial physician lived in a house that could have sheltered half your district. His garden bloomed with healing herbs that grew nowhere else in the province, tended by servants who knew more about medicine than most of the local healers combined. When you finally gathered courage and coin enough to approach his gates, the consultation fee alone cost more than your family spent on food in 3 months. The examination would cost twice that. Treatment, if needed, would require selling the small plot of land that had fed your family for generations. You stood in his marble receiving hall, hat crushed in nervous hands, while he explained your mother's condition with the casual precision of someone diagnosing problems he would never personally carry. Her lungs were flooding slowly, he said, like a boat with a leak too small to see, but too persistent to ignore. The medicine existed, rare compounds from eastern mountains, techniques learned in the imperial medical colleges. Recovery was possible, perhaps even probable. The cost was simply the price of everything you owned, plus several years of everything you might ever own. Meanwhile, old Elena, who lived near the river, had been mixing willow bark tea with honey and strange-smelling herbs that actually seemed to ease your mother's breathing. She charged nothing but asked only for help mending her roof before winter deepened. Her grandmother had taught her the recipes, she said, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. Generations of women passing healing knowledge from hand to hand, mouth to ear, heart to heart. Then the imperial inspectors arrived, their official seals glinting like weapons in the autumn sun. Elena's herbs were unlicensed medicine, they announced. Her healing was dangerous practice by untrained individuals. The fines were substantial, the threat of imprisonment real. Within a week, Elena's jars were emptied into the river. Her knowledge suddenly transformed from wisdom into crime by the simple act of official disapproval. You watched the herbs swirl away in the current, willow bark that might have eased your mother's pain, roots that might have cleared her breathing, leaves that might have given your family a few more precious months together. The water carried them toward the sea while your mother's cough echoed through another sleepless night, counting out the rhythm of time running short and options growing fewer. The mathematics of suffering revealed themselves with brutal clarity. The imperial physician's treatment would save your mother, but destroy your family's future. Elena's herbs might have helped without such devastating cost, but law had transformed compassion into contraband. Between these impossibilities, your mother's breathing grew more labored, and your choices narrowed to the width of the space between one breath and the next. In the market, you heard whispers of other families facing similar calculations. The merchant's wife who sold her jewelry for fever medicine that worked no better than Elena's forbidden teas. The blacksmith who borrowed against next year's earnings to pay for surgery. His daughter might not survive anyway. Health had become a luxury item, rationed according to ability to pay rather than need to live. Your mother, propped up on pillows that no longer brought comfort, spoke between coughs about the old days when healing came from neighbors rather than institutions, when compassion flowed like water toward whoever needed it most. Her words carried the weight of understanding that she was dying, not just from illness, but from a system that had transformed medicine from service into commerce, healing from calling into calculation. The smell of Elena's confiscated herbs lingered in your memory like an accusation. Chamomile for sleep, mint for nausea, willow bark for pain, simple remedies that had served your people for centuries before official medicine declared them inadequate. You wondered how many others were coughing through the night because traditional knowledge had been legislated into illegality, because wisdom had been regulated out of reach. In the longest hours before dawn, when your mother's breathing counted out the seconds like a clock winding down, you held her hand and felt the weight of choices that should never have to be made. The imperial physician's bills sat on your table like stones, each figure representing months of work, years of sacrifice, the slow dissolution of everything your family had built across generations. Health, you realized, had become the most expensive thing you'd never thought to budget for. The right to live without pain, to breathe without struggle, to hope for tomorrow. These had somehow transformed from basic human needs into premium services available only to those who could afford the asking price. Healing, you think, should flow like water toward whoever needs it most, regardless of their ability to pay. Instead, it pools in places where gold runs deepest, while those who thirst most desperately watch from the edges of wells they cannot afford to drink from. Your mother's cough echoes through another night, marking time that costs more than you will ever have. They gave you the right to petition. They just forgot to mention anyone would listen. The petition forms arrived at the district office with great ceremony, accompanied by announcements that painted participation in governance as both privilege and duty. Citizens could now formally request changes, file complaints, suggest improvements to the grand machinery of imperial administration. The clerk handed you the papers with the same expression he wore when distributing grain rations. Dutiful but distant, fulfilling obligation without enthusiasm. The forms themselves spoke a language you recognized but couldn't quite comprehend, filled with phrases like pursuant to imperial statute and subject to administrative review. Each blank space seemed to demand not just information, but translation of your simple needs into the complex vocabulary of bureaucratic process. Your complaint about the missing water pipes became infrastructure inadequacy affecting residential zones. Your concern about double taxation transformed into fiscal irregularities requiring clarification of assessment protocols. The filing fee, modest by imperial standards, represented 3 days of your wages. The processing fee, charged separately, cost nearly as much again. By the time you purchased the required stamps, paid for notarization, and compensated the scribe who translated your concerns into proper administrative language, your petition had consumed more resources than some of the problems it described. The system, you realized, had found a way to charge you for the privilege of documenting your own suffering. Room 47B became as familiar as your own kitchen over the following months. The clerk behind the desk, a young man whose soft hands had never known genuine labor, developed the peculiar skill of appearing to listen while obviously hearing nothing at all. Your petition, he assured you repeatedly, was under review by the appropriate departments. Which departments, he couldn't say. How long the review might take, he couldn't estimate. Whether anyone had actually read your carefully worded grievances, he couldn't confirm. The waiting room filled with familiar faces as weeks turned to months. The widow seeking compensation for her husband's military service. The farmer requesting permission to sell grain at market prices rather than the fixed rates that barely covered his costs. The mother asking for safe passage for her children on roads that bandits claimed after dark. All of you carrying papers that documented problems everyone could see, but apparently no one could solve. Your petition moved through the system like water through sand, slowly, invisibly, leaving no trace of its passage. From room 47B to the Department of Rural Affairs, then to the Office of Infrastructure Assessment, then to the Bureau of Citizen Relations, then back to room 47B for additional documentation. Each transfer required new forms, additional fees, updated statements that proved you still suffered from problems that had grown worse during the months of bureaucratic circulation. The beautiful irony revealed itself gradually. The petition system, designed to give citizens voice in their governance, had become a mechanism for absorbing that voice into a vast administrative silence. Your words disappeared into filing cabinets like prayers whispered into empty churches. The forms accumulated in government offices while the problems they described accumulated in your daily life. Sometimes you encountered other petitioners in the hallways, all of you carrying folders thick with carbon copies and official stamps. You shared the weary camaraderie of people navigating the same labyrinth, comparing notes about which clerks might actually process paperwork versus which ones simply moved it from one desk to another. Your small rebellions became sharing information about shortcuts through the maze, warning each other about fees that weren't mentioned until after you'd waited in line for hours. The young clerk in room 47B eventually learned your name, not from caring about your case, but from the simple repetition of your presence. He greeted you with the mild irritation of someone encountering the same obstacle repeatedly. Your persistence had become his problem, not because he intended to solve it, but because you reminded him daily that some problems refuse to disappear into proper filing systems. Your voice, recorded on dozens of forms and filed in multiple departments, had somehow become both everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Every word you'd spoken had been documented, categorized, referenced, and stored. Yet none of those words seemed to have reached anyone with the power or inclination to act upon them. You existed in the government's filing system more completely than you existed in its consciousness. The petition process taught you the difference between being heard and being listened to, between being documented and being understood. Your complaints had been recorded with bureaucratic precision, but recording, you learned, was not the same as receiving. The system had developed the ability to absorb infinite amounts of citizen input without actually digesting any of it. In the quiet moments, you wondered if the petition system served its intended purpose perfectly, not by solving problems, but by giving citizens the illusion that their problems could be solved through proper channels. The forms provided hope. The process consumed time and energy that might otherwise fuel more direct action. and the eventual non-responses taught people that change came not from asking, but from accepting. Your voice had become drops of water falling on marble, heard but never absorbed, documented but never integrated, acknowledged but never answered. The echo of your concerns bounced through administrative corridors, growing fainter with each repetition until they faded into the general hum of bureaucratic background noise. Words, you discovered, echo longest in empty rooms. Perhaps it's time to find an audience that can hear, to discover whether your voice might carry different weight in different spaces, to learn if speaking truth to power requires finding power that has ears to match its authority. Earth doesn't lie, unlike the deeds that claim to own it. Your grandfather's hands had shaped this soil for 47 years, coaxing olives from rocky ground that seemed too stubborn for cultivation. Each tree knew his touch, each stone had been placed by his careful planning, each terrace carved by his understanding of how water wanted to flow down the hillside. When he died, the land grieved in its own quiet way. The olive harvest that year tasted of salt tears, and the ancient oak by the well dropped its leaves early, as if autumn had arrived ahead of schedule to honor his passing. The deed that appeared 3 months later bore signatures you didn't recognize and seals that glittered with official authority. Lord Marcellus of the Eastern Province, it declared, had held legal title to these acres since before your grandfather had been born. The documentation was thorough, convincing, backed by witness statements from men who swore they remembered your family as tenant farmers rather than landowners. For the right price, apparently, memory could be purchased as easily as any other commodity. The irony cut deeper than winter frost. Your grandfather had bought this land with coins saved from selling vegetables in the market square, purchasing it from a widow whose husband had died owing taxes he couldn't pay. The original deed, written in your grandfather's careful script and witnessed by half the village, rested in the wooden box beneath your mother's bed. Proof that meant nothing when power decided to rewrite history with newer, more official ink. Lord Marcellus himself never visited the land he claimed to own. His steward arrived instead, a thin man with soft hands who walked the terraces like he was measuring them for sale. He spoke of agricultural efficiency and optimal resource utilization, words that transformed your grandfather's lifetime. Of careful cultivation into mere numbers on accounting ledgers. The olive trees, he noted, were irregularly spaced. The irrigation channels followed inconvenient curves. The whole operation, he concluded, reflected peasant sentiment rather than practical farming. The eviction notice came with soldiers, because, apparently, legal documents required military enforcement when the people being evicted had nowhere else to go. They were young men from distant provinces who spoke your language with foreign accents, following orders they didn't question about problems they didn't understand. Their sergeant, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, read the official proclamation with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this duty many times before. You tried to explain about the olive trees, how your grandfather had grafted wild stock to domestic branches, creating varieties that bore fruit in years when other orchards failed. You described the irrigation system he'd designed, channels that captured and conserved every drop of precious rainwater, terraces that prevented erosion while maximizing planting space. Your words bounced off their armor like pebbles thrown at castle walls, technically heard but practically ignored. The soil beneath your feet remembered everything the deeds forgot. It held the salt of your grandfather's sweat, the memory of seeds planted with hope, the patient accumulation of seasons that had transformed rocky hillside into productive farmland. Each handful of earth contained the story of your family's devotion, the quiet heroism of people who had fed their community while asking nothing more than the right to continue working land they loved. Your olive trees stood witness to the legal fiction unfolding around them. The largest tree, older than your grandfather himself, bore scars from the drought of his 20th year, when he had carried water bucket by bucket from the distant well to keep the saplings alive. Its gnarled trunk recorded the history of storms weathered, harvests celebrated, seasons of plenty and seasons of want that had shaped both tree and farmer into partners in the ancient dance of cultivation. The new deed claimed that Lord Marcellus had planted these groves, designed these terraces, built these stone walls that kept the hillside from washing away during winter rains. Paper had transformed your grandfather from creator to trespasser, from owner to thief of his own life's work. Legal language had the power to rewrite history, but it couldn't change the way the trees leaned toward the morning sun following. Patterns your grandfather had taught them through decades of careful pruning. As the soldiers waited for you to gather possessions you'd never expected to carry away, you knelt and filled a small cloth bag with soil from the root zone of the oldest olive tree. The earth felt warm in your palm, heavy with memory and purpose. This handful of your grandfather's legacy would travel with you wherever exile might lead, carrying the genetic signature of home in its mineral composition. The land remembers everything: the placement of each stone, the pattern of each planting, the careful balance between human need and natural limitation that your grandfather had spent a lifetime learning to navigate. Deeds might reassign ownership with official stamps and witness signatures, but they couldn't transfer the intimate knowledge that allowed this difficult ground to flourish under loving hands. Walking away, you turned back once to see strangers, measuring your grandfather's terraces with surveying equipment, reducing his poetry of stone and soil to the prose of property assessment. They would calculate the maximum extraction potential, optimize the water usage, standardize the planting, patterns according to imperial agricultural guidelines. Efficiency would replace affection, and the land would learn to serve new masters who valued productivity over relationship. Land remembers everything. Laws, you've learned, have shorter memories, shaped by the immediate needs of power rather than the long wisdom of seasons. But memory, like love, has roots that go deeper than law can reach, growing in the secret spaces where earth meets heart, where the truth of belonging cannot be extracted by official process or erased by newer, more convenient versions of history. Dignity, it turns out, is the most expensive thing they never tell you you're buying. The summons arrived on parchment that cost more than your weekly wage, delivered by a messenger whose horse was better fed than most families in your district. You were to appear before the district magistrate to answer charges of disturbing public order through seditious speech. The accusation centered on words you'd spoken in the market square, not shouted in anger, but spoken quietly to your neighbor, while watching tax collectors seize another family's winter stores. The system protects itself, you had said, voice barely above a whisper, by making sure that questioning it costs more than accepting it. Apparently, even whispered truth could be heard by the right ears, when those ears belonged to informants who supplemented their meager incomes by reporting dangerous thoughts to authorities who paid for information regardless of its accuracy. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less time than it took the magistrate to eat his morning meal. Evidence consisted of the informant's testimony, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a reliable source of extra income. Your defense, that you had merely observed what everyone could see, was dismissed as irrelevant. To the legal question of whether your words had potential to disturb imperial order, intent, apparently, mattered less than impact. And impact could be determined by officials without reference to actual consequences. The sentence was precisely calibrated to achieve maximum humiliation, with minimum administrative effort. You would stand in the market square at midday, when the sun was highest and the crowd largest, and publicly apologize for speaking against the wisdom of imperial governance. The words of your apology were provided in advance, written in the flowery language of official contrition, phrases that transformed your quiet observation into dangerous rebellion requiring public correction. Standing in that square where you'd bought vegetables and shared gossip for 30 years, surrounded by neighbors who had heard your children's first words and celebrated your family's small victories, you felt the weight of degradation settle on your shoulders like a cloak made of lead. The script in your hands demanded that you confess to crimes you hadn't committed, apologize for thoughts you still believed true, and promise compliance with systems you knew to be unjust. Your neighbor Eleanor, who had witnessed the original conversation, stood in the crowd with tears running silently down her weathered cheeks. She knew, as everyone present knew, that your crime had been nothing more than speaking aloud what all of them thought in private. But she also knew, as they all knew, that public truth-telling had become a luxury none of them could afford. The price of honesty had been set deliberately high to ensure that most people would choose affordable silence instead. The words of apology tasted like copper coins in your mouth, the metallic flavor of transactions that purchase safety at the cost of self-respect. Each phrase was carefully crafted to sound voluntary while being entirely coerced, to appear sincere while everyone present understood it as performance. You spoke the required sentences while your true thoughts echoed silently in the space between what you said and what you meant. The crowd's silence carried more weight than any response they might have offered. They watched with the careful neutrality of people who understood that witnessing had become dangerous, that even sympathetic expressions might be interpreted as support for seditious ideas. Their eyes held the mixture of compassion and relief. Common to those who watch someone else pay a price, they might easily have been required to pay themselves. After the apology, the magistrate nodded with satisfaction at a job efficiently completed. Public order had been maintained through the simple expedient of demonstrating the cost of questioning authority. The system had defended itself by transforming your quiet observation into a public spectacle that would discourage similar observations from others who had witnessed the consequences of speaking uncomfortable truths. Walking home through streets where neighbors now avoided eye contact, you carried the weight of humiliation like a physical burden. The official punishment had ended, but its effects rippled outward through relationships that would never quite recover their former ease. You had become living proof that the system would exact payment for truth-telling, and that payment would be extracted not just from speakers but from the communities forced to witness their degradation. The real genius of the punishment revealed itself in the days that followed. Your public apology had created a barrier between you and others who might share your concerns, but now feared association with someone who had been officially marked as troublesome. Isolation became part of the penalty, ensuring that your willingness to speak truth would not spread through the quiet conversations where resistance typically begins. Yet in the private spaces of your own heart, dignity survived the public performance of its apparent surrender. You had spoken truth when speaking truth carried a price, and that truth remained true, regardless of the words you'd been forced to say in public contradiction of your own beliefs. Honor, you discovered, could survive humiliation by distinguishing between public performance and private principle. The system had required you to participate in your own degradation, to speak words that denied your own observations, to apologize for seeing what everyone could see but had learned not to say. But dignity, like underground streams, could flow beneath the surface even when official channels tried to dam or redirect its course. Honor, you realized, was like water in a cracked jar. It took constant effort to to keep it from leaking away, through the small compromises and daily humiliations that authority used to wear down resistance. But effort, carefully applied, could preserve the essential contents, even when the container showed obvious damage from the pressure it had been forced to bear. In the end, your loudest complaint was the one you never spoke aloud. 13 grievances had found their way into words. Water that never flowed, taxes collected twice, dowries stolen by official theft, grain that rotted while families starved, roads that ended before arriving, justice that wore silk instead of blindfolds, schools that taught only the wealthy, medicine priced beyond mortal reach, petitions that disappeared into administrative silence, land stolen by legal fiction, voices that couldn't speak, and honor that came with receipts requiring public payment. But the 14th grievance, the one that contained and explained all, the others, remained locked in the space between your heart and your voice. It was the understanding that had grown slowly through months of accumulated injustice, the recognition that these weren't separate problems, but symptoms of a single, overwhelming truth. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, and you were not included in that design. This was the grievance that couldn't be spoken, because it challenged not specific policies, but the entire structure that created those policies. It wasn't about reform, but about the fundamental question of whether governance existed to serve citizens, or whether citizens existed to serve governance. Speaking this truth would be like questioning the nature of rivers while standing in the flood. Technically possible, but practically fatal. You had learned to recognize the careful architecture of powerlessness, the way each small injustice connected to every other, to form a comprehensive system for extracting wealth, labor, and compliance from people who had little choice but to provide all three. The genius lay not in any single oppression, but in the accumulation of oppressions that left citizens too exhausted to resist effectively and too isolated to organize meaningfully. The unspoken grievance lived in the space between your ribs, heavy as stones carried uphill, weighing on your breathing during the long nights when sleep fled from thoughts too large for comfortable rest. It spoke itself in the language of understanding that had no safe words, in the vocabulary of truths that couldn't be shared without destroying the speaker along with anyone who heard them clearly. Standing now before palace gates that had heard 1,000 similar stories, you carried 13 complaints that could be spoken and one that could only be lived. The silence had its own weight, its own presence, its own power to communicate what words would make too dangerous to acknowledge. Some truths were too large for language, too complete for partial expression, too fundamental for safe discussion. Your neighbors carried the same unspoken understanding, the same careful silence about the same overwhelming recognition. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses that followed questions no one dared answer completely, in the looks exchanged when official explanations failed to explain what everyone could see. The silence had become a shared language, a community of understanding that existed precisely because it couldn't be spoken aloud. The guards at the palace gates had heard this silence before, had learned to recognize the weight of unspoken truths in the shoulders of petitioners who carried more than they could safely say. They understood that the most dangerous complaints were often the ones that never found voice, the grievances that remained locked in silence, not from lack of courage, but from excessive understanding about what speaking would cost. Walking forward, through gates that separated citizen from power, you felt the weight of accumulated silence pressing against the boundaries of what could be safely expressed. 13 grievances could be discussed, debated, potentially addressed through the normal mechanisms of governance. But the 14th grievance challenged the legitimacy of those mechanisms themselves. questioned the right of the system to exist in its current form. The unspoken complaint contained all the others, like a seed contains the entire tree. Compact, essential, carrying within itself the potential to grow into something that could transform the landscape if given proper conditions. But seeds, like truths, required safe ground for planting. And safe ground had become increasingly difficult to find in an empire that treated questions like weeds, requiring immediate removal. Your silence screamed louder than any words you could have chosen, carrying the accumulated weight of all the other silences. Your neighbors who didn't speak of their own suffering. Your children who had learned not to ask why their opportunities were limited. Your wife who no longer mentioned dreams that the system had made too expensive to afford. Collective silence had become a form of collective testimony, bearing witness to truths too dangerous for individual expression. The palace rose before you like a mountain made of human decisions, each stone representing choices that had prioritized some lives over others, some needs over others, some futures over others. Your silence contained questions about who had made those choices, by what authority, according to what principles, with what consideration for people like you who lived with the consequences of decisions they had never been consulted about. As you approached the throne room where your 13 spoken grievances would receive official hearing. Your 14th grievance, the one that encompassed and explained all the others, remained safely locked in silence. It would speak itself through the spaces between your words, communicate itself through the pauses in your testimony, make itself known through the weight of everything you carefully chose not to say. Silence sometimes speaks louder than any words you could choose. It carries truths too large for language, too complete for partial expression, too fundamental for safe discussion. Your unspoken grievance would fill the throne room like invisible smoke, present in every breath, impossible to ignore even when it remained officially unacknowledged. And so, you walked toward the throne room, carrying 12 grievances and one overwhelming truth. That silence, sometimes, is the loudest answer of all, the most complete testimony, the most honest response to systems that have made honesty too expensive for ordinary citizens to afford. Your silence screams with the voice of everyone who has learned that some truths can only be carried, never spoken, never shared, never released, only lived with the quiet dignity of those who understand more than they can safely say. He spoke, and marble listened. The throne room stretched before him like a valley carved from stone and ambition, its dimensions calculated to reduce individual humans to the scale of insects navigating between the feet of giants. Columns rose toward a ceiling painted with scenes of imperial victory, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness that reflected his small figure from dozens of angles, multiplying his presence while simultaneously diminishing it through endless repetition. He walked forward across floors that had been walked by thousands of petitioners before him, each footstep adding to the accumulated echo of citizens who had brought their hopes and grievances to this chamber where power sat in judgment of powerlessness. The marble beneath his sandals had been quarried from mountains whose names he didn't know, carried by laborers whose faces had been forgotten, assembled by craftsmen whose skills served purposes they would never understand. The courtiers shifted, like silk in a breeze, their attention drifting between his words and their own private concerns. The evening's entertainment, tomorrow's appointments, the delicate negotiations that occupied minds accustomed to treating governance as an elaborate game played with other people's lives as pieces. His suffering had become their brief diversion, his desperate hopes transformed into another day's business, requiring polite attention but no emotional investment. His voice carried the weight of everyone who had sent him here. Neighbors who had pooled their small coins to pay his travel expenses. Families who had shared their stories in whispered conversations by firelight. Children who had drawn pictures of the schools they dreamed of attending. He spoke not just his own grievances, but the accumulated silence of his entire district, carrying voices that would never reach this marble chamber where individual suffering was processed into policy considerations. The throne itself remained empty during his recitation, a massive chair carved from single block of stone that had required 100 men to move into position. Its emptiness seemed intentional, suggesting that power was too great to be contained in any individual ruler, too important to be reduced to mere human presence. The absence spoke louder than presence might have, reminding everyone that authority existed independent of any particular person who might temporarily occupy its symbols. As his final words faded into the decorated silence of the great chamber, the marble seemed to settle back into its eternal stillness, unchanged by anything. It had heard. The statues resumed their stone watching. The columns continued their patient bearing of architectural weight. The floors prepared to receive the footsteps of the next petitioner, who would bring similar hopes to this place where hope came to be formally acknowledged and quietly buried. The courtiers began their subtle movements toward exits, their attention already shifting to whatever came next in their carefully scheduled days. His words would be recorded by scribes whose hands moved automatically across parchment, documenting everything while absorbing nothing, creating official records of conversations that had been heard but not received, acknowledged but not understood. The king sat silent, as kings do when the weight of kingdoms presses against the weight of single human hearts, when individual suffering must be weighed against imperial necessity, when the mathematics of governance reduces personal tragedy to statistical, acceptable loss. His silence contained all the responses he couldn't give, all the solutions he couldn't offer, all the changes he couldn't make without unraveling the very system that gave him power to sit in judgment. Kings, he had learned, were prisoners of their own power. The citizen's voice faded into the marble silence of the throne room, but his words continued echoing in the chambers of the king's mind, long after the formal audience had ended. 12 grievances spoken aloud, and one, the most important one, that lived in the spaces between the others, in the careful pauses, in the weight of everything that couldn't be safely said even here, especially here, in this room where power and powerlessness met in their ancient, unequal dance. The king had heard such grievances before, would hear them again, each petitioner carrying the accumulated suffering of entire communities who had pooled their hope and sent representatives to speak truths that everyone knew but few dared acknowledge. The mathematics of empire required such suffering, not as deliberate cruelty, but as acceptable cost. The price of maintaining systems that created wealth and stability for some by extracting it from others who had no choice but to pay. He understood, with the clarity that came from years of making impossible decisions, that fixing any single grievance would require unraveling the entire tapestry of governance that held the empire together. The water that didn't flow to rural districts was diverted to serve the capital's fountains and the estates of those whose support kept the throne secure. The taxes collected twice paid for armies that prevented rebellion and bureaucrats who prevented chaos. The schools that served only the wealthy ensured that power remained concentrated among those who understood its proper use. The citizen who stood before his throne didn't understand, couldn't understand, the delicate balance of interests that his grievances threatened to disturb. Clean water for rural districts would require raising taxes on urban merchants who already grumbled about their burden. Fair taxation would reduce revenue needed for military expenses that kept neighboring kingdoms from testing imperial borders. Universal education would create expectations that the current system couldn't satisfy without fundamental reorganization that might collapse everything. Yet the king also understood, with equal clarity, that the citizen was right. The grievances were legitimate, the suffering real, the injustices undeniable. The system worked exactly as it had been designed to work, and that design systematically excluded the needs of people, like the man who stood before him carrying the hopes of entire communities on his shoulders. The empire's success depended on the failure of its most vulnerable citizens to receive what they needed to thrive. This was the impossible mathematics of power. Every solution created new problems. Every act of justice required acts of injustice elsewhere. Every improvement in one area demanded deterioration in another. The king's power was absolute in theory, but completely constrained in practice by the need to balance competing interests that would tear the empire apart if not carefully managed through compromises that satisfied no one completely but prevented anyone from rebelling successfully. The citizens' unspoken grievance, the one that encompassed all the others, challenged not specific policies but the legitimacy of the entire system. He questioned, without quite saying so, whether governance existed to serve citizens or whether citizens existed to serve governance. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from incense, present in every breath, but impossible to address directly without igniting fires that would consume everything. The king carried his own unspoken grievances, his own accumulated understanding of the cage that power had built around him. He grieved for the solutions he couldn't implement, the justice he couldn't deliver, the changes he couldn't make without destroying the stability that kept millions of other citizens fed, housed, and relatively safe. His power to help was exactly balanced by his responsibility not to harm, leaving him frozen in a position where any significant action would create more suffering than it prevented. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the palace slept and he sat alone with scrolls that documented the empire's endless needs, the king often wondered whether his citizen petitioners understood the weight of what they asked. They wanted individual justice in a system built on systematic injustice, personal relief from problems that were structural rather than accidental, solutions that would require him to choose their welfare over the welfare of others who depended on current arrangements for their survival. The empire was like a vast machine designed to transform the labor and resources of many into the comfort and security of few. But stopping the machine would leave everyone, including those it currently exploited, worse off than continuing to operate it with minor adjustments that improved efficiency without changing fundamental distribution of benefits and costs. The king's job was to maintain the machine, not to question whether it should be redesigned or dismantled. Yet he also knew that the machine was breaking down slowly, that the cost of maintaining current arrangements was rising while the benefits declined, that the accumulation of grievances like those he had just heard was creating pressure that would eventually find release through channels that wouldn't respect the careful balances he worked so hard to preserve. The citizens' silence contained the seeds of upheavals that could destroy everything the king had spent his reign trying to protect. The tragedy was that both king and citizen were right, and both were trapped in roles that prevented them from acting on their understanding. The citizen was right that the system was unjust, but lacked power to change it. The king had power to change it, but using that power would create chaos that would harm the very people the citizen represented. They faced each other across an unbridgeable gap, each seeing clearly what the other couldn't do, neither able to escape the logic that kept them locked in positions that satisfied neither justice nor pragmatism. And so the king rose, carrying the weight of answers that would satisfy no one, least of all himself. preparing to deliver the kind of response that acknowledged truth without promising change, that recognized suffering without offering remedy, that honored the citizens' courage, while protecting the system that made such courage necessary. The mathematics of power required responses that were simultaneously honest and inadequate, compassionate and cruel, wise and foolish. The burden of kingship was not the power to do whatever he wanted, but the responsibility to want only what he could do without destroying everything else that depended on his restraint. The citizens' grievances would receive the only answer the king could give: respectful attention followed by careful inaction, acknowledgement followed by preservation of the status quo that created grievances faster than individual responses could address them. Justice, when it finally spoke, chose its words carefully. The king rose from contemplation like a man surfacing from deep water, carrying with him the weight of understanding that couldn't be translated into action, the burden of truth that couldn't be spoken without destroying the careful lies that held empire together. His movement rippled through the throne room like wind across still water, alerting courtiers and scribes to the moment when royal silence would transform into royal speech. The words, when they came, had been polished by years of similar moments, shaped by the accumulated experience of delivering responses that needed to acknowledge truth while avoiding commitment, recognize suffering while preserving the systems that created it. Each phrase was carefully calibrated to sound compassionate without promising change, authoritative without accepting responsibility, wise without admitting the impossibility of wisdom in circumstances that offered only choices between different forms of failure. "Your grievances have been heard," the king began, his voice carrying the formal tones that transformed personal conversation into official pronouncement. "The concerns you raise reflect the challenges faced by many of our citizens in districts throughout the empire. These matters require careful consideration of their impact on all our people, not merely those directly affected by current circumstances." The citizen listened with the concentrated attention of someone who understood that these words would determine whether his long journey had meaning or whether he would return home carrying the same burdens he had brought to this marble chamber. Around him, courtiers and scribes maintained the careful neutrality of people who had witnessed this scene many times before, who knew how such audiences typically concluded but were required to treat each one as if its outcome remained uncertain. "The imperial administration will review the specific issues you have raised," the king continued, his words flowing like water around stones, finding paths that avoided direct collision with obstacles while appearing to address them. "Departments responsible for water distribution, tax assessment, educational policy, and rural development will receive instructions to examine current practices in light of the concerns you have documented." The promise of review carried the weight of all promises that cost nothing to make and less to keep. Reviews could continue indefinitely without reaching conclusions. Examinations could proceed without discovering problems. Instructions could be issued without expectation of compliance. The language of bureaucratic response had evolved to create the appearance of action while ensuring that nothing significant would change. Yet within the careful neutrality of official language, the citizen detected something else, a recognition that went beyond formal acknowledgement, an understanding that couldn't be spoken directly but lived in the spaces between words. The king's eyes carried the weight of someone who saw clearly what couldn't be changed, who understood the truth of every grievance while remaining powerless to address their underlying causes. The empire faces many challenges in balancing the needs of all citizens while maintaining the stability that ensures our collective security and prosperity, the king said, his words acknowledging what couldn't be solved while explaining why solutions remained elusive. Individual hardships, while deeply regrettable, must be weighed against broader concerns that affect the welfare of entire populations. The courtiers nodded with the practiced agreement of people who had learned to find wisdom in whatever their ID king said, regardless of whether his words offered wisdom or merely the appearance of thoughtful consideration. Their approval served as punctuation for royal speech, marking the rhythm of official pronouncement while adding no substance to its meaning. The citizen felt the verdict settling around him like evening mist, not the clear rejection he had feared, nor the dramatic justice he had hoped for, but something more ambiguous and perhaps more honest. He was being told, in language too diplomatic to wound but too clear to misunderstand, that his suffering was real but unimportant, his grievances legitimate but irrelevant, his courage admirable but insufficient to motivate change. Your journey to bring these concerns to royal attention demonstrates the dedication of citizens who take seriously their responsibilities to contribute to imperial welfare, the king concluded, transforming the citizens' desperate search for justice into civic duty, his personal anguish into patriotic service. Such dedication strengthens the bonds between ruler and ruled that form the foundation of our shared prosperity. The words hung in the marble air like incense smoke, creating atmosphere without substance, suggesting meaning without delivering it. The audience was ending with the same careful ambiguity that had characterized its middle: acknowledgement without commitment, recognition without remedy, respect without relief. The citizen bowed as protocol required, accepting dismissal with the same dignity he had brought to petition. His grievances had been received by power, processed through the machinery of official consideration, and returned to him transformed from urgent problems requiring solutions into documented concerns, suitable for administrative review. Nothing had changed except the official status of his suffering, which was now formally recognized rather than merely personally experienced. As he turned to leave, the great doors opened to reveal the world beyond the palace. Streets where his problems continued unchanged. Districts where water still didn't flow. Communities where children still couldn't read. Families where medicine remained too expensive for healing. The marble chamber had provided audience for his truth-telling, but no remedy for the truths he had told. The king watched him go with the expression of someone who had just performed a duty that served neither justice nor injustice, but something more complex: the preservation of order that required both the appearance of responsiveness and the reality of constraint. The system had absorbed another challenge to its legitimacy by appearing to take that challenge seriously, while ensuring that its substance would be lost in processes designed to transform urgent problems into manageable administrative concerns. Dusk was settling over the capital as the citizen emerged from the palace, painting the sky in colors that matched his mood, neither bright with hope nor dark with despair, but caught in the ambiguous light that exists between day and night, success and failure, truth acknowledged and truth acted upon. His shadow grew longer as he walked away from the seat of power, stretching toward home where people waited to hear whether their hopes had found reception in the marble chambers, where their fate was decided by those who would never share their circumstances. The palace gates closed behind him like parentheses around a sentence that had been spoken but not completed, acknowledged but not answered, heard but not heeded. Justice had spoken, as it always did, in the careful language of power that recognized truth while preserving the conditions that made such truth-telling necessary. And now you drift back to your bed, carrying the weight of one man's courage and one king's impossible choice. The marble halls fade like morning mist, leaving you in the familiar darkness of your own room, where silence feels different than it did an hour ago. Your pillow knows the shape of your head, your blankets hold the warmth of your body, but something has shifted in the space between sleeping and waking. You've walked with a citizen through palace gates, stood beside him as he spoke truth to power, witnessed the careful dance between justice acknowledged and justice delivered. Perhaps you recognize something of yourself in his 12 grievances, or 13, or 14. The quiet accumulations of unfairness that collect like dust in the corners of ordinary life. The water bill that seems too high, the tax form that makes no sense, the school that doesn't teach what children need to, no, the medicine that costs more than hope can afford. His ancient grievances wear modern clothes, but their essence remains unchanged across centuries. The gap between what systems promise and what they deliver, the distance between power and the people it's meant to serve. The citizen's unspoken 14th grievance lives in your silence too. The understanding that individual problems often reflect systematic choices, that personal struggles frequently result from structural arrangements designed to benefit some at the expense of others. Like him, you've learned that speaking such truths carries costs that must be carefully calculated against benefits that may never arrive. Like him, you've discovered that some conversations are too dangerous for public spaces, but too important for private silence. His courage feels familiar because you've needed similar courage in smaller moments. The times you've spoken up when speaking up was uncomfortable. The occasions when you've chosen truth over safety. The quiet rebellions against unfairness that happen in meeting rooms and classrooms and family conversations. His walk through palace gates mirrors your own journeys through doors that separate ordinary people from the forces that shape their lives. The king's impossible burden might feel familiar too. The weight of understanding problems you can't solve, seeing needs you can't meet, knowing truths you can't act upon without creating larger problems. Perhaps you felt similar constraints in your own spheres of influence, caught between wanting to help and being limited by systems, resources, relationships that require careful balance. Leadership, at any level, often means carrying the weight of other people's hopes while being constrained by realities they don't see. But there's comfort in the citizen's dignity, in the way he carried himself through palace halls that were designed to diminish him. His quiet strength speaks to the nobility that lives in ordinary people who refuse to be broken by circumstances beyond their control, who maintain their humanity even when systems treat them as problems to be managed rather than people to be served. His example suggests that there's victory in the simple act of truth-telling, regardless of whether that truth produces immediate change. The marble chambers where he spoke have heard thousands of similar stories and will hear thousands more. Power, it seems, requires constant reminder of its responsibilities, regular testimony from those who live with its consequences. The citizen's voice joins a vast chorus of others who have carried grievances to authority, who have spoken truth to power, who have maintained that individual suffering matters even when systems suggest otherwise. Sleep beckons now with the promise of democracy, the place where all souls receive equal audience, where dreams treat king and citizen with identical consideration, where rest comes to everyone regardless of their earthly status. In sleep, the distance between marble halls and modest bedrooms disappears. The gap between power and powerlessness closes. The weight of unsolved problems lifts from shoulders too small to carry them alone. Your own small rebellions against injustice matter more than any king's verdict, more than any system's official response. They matter because they preserve the part of you that refuses to accept unfairness as inevitable, that insists on the possibility of better arrangements, that maintains hope even when hope seems unreasonable. Like the citizen walking away from palace gates, you carry the quiet dignity of those who speak truth to power, even when power chooses not to listen. The ancient story fades into the timeless rhythm of your breathing, carrying with it the whispered promise that ordinary courage is never wasted, that small acts of resistance accumulate like drops of water that eventually carve canyons through solid stone. The citizen's voice joins your own in the eternal conversation between what is and what might be, between acceptance and aspiration, between silence and speech. Rest now, knowing that your own quiet dignity matters, that your small rebellions against injustice contribute to changes too large for any individual to see, but too important for any individual to abandon. Sleep well, carrying the peaceful understanding that truth-telling has its own value, regardless of its immediate reception, regardless of its apparent consequences. The citizen's shadow grows longer as evening settles around his journey home, stretching toward communities where people wait to hear whether their hopes found reception in marble halls. But his real victory wasn't in the king's response. It was in his willingness to speak, to carry community truth to the seats of power, to maintain his dignity in spaces designed to diminish it. Dreams welcome you now with the gentle promise that some stories end not with resolution, but with recognition, not with solutions, but with acknowledgement that problems are real and witnesses matter. In the democracy of sleep, every voice carries equal weight. Every dream deserves equal attention. Every rest provides equal restoration. Sleep well, knowing that your own small rebellions against injustice matter more than any king's verdict. Rest, carrying the quiet dignity of those who speak truth to power, even when power chooses not to listen. Close your eyes and let the ancient rhythm of breathing carry you toward the place where all souls receive equal audience, where justice sleeps peacefully beside those who seek it, where the weight of the world lifts from shoulders too human to carry it alone. The citizen walks home through gathering dusk, and you drift toward dreams where his courage and your own meet in the timeless space where truth echoes longest, where dignity rests most peacefully, where sleep provides the justice that waking hours sometimes withhold. Rest now. Rest. Arrange themselves along the walls like expensive furniture, their silk robes rustling with the sound of wealth that never worried about next month's rent or next winter's food supplies. They had perfected the art of seeming to listen while actually calculating, measuring the political implications of each grievance, estimating the cost of potential solutions, weighing the benefits of action against the safety of inaction. Their faces wore expressions of professional sympathy, emotions as carefully tailored as their clothing. His voice, when he finally spoke, seemed to disappear into the vast space above his head, absorbed by air that had heard everything and been changed by nothing. He spoke of water that didn't flow, speaking to people whose fountains sang all night. He described taxes that came twice, addressing those who collected rather than paid them. He explained about children who couldn't read while surrounded by men whose education had been purchased at prices his family couldn't imagine affording. The statues that lined the great hall bore witness with stone eyes that had seen centuries of such scenes. Emperors carved in marble watched with the permanent expression of people who had never doubted their right to rule, their faces frozen in the confidence that came from never having to question the source of their authority. They had been sculpted by artists who understood that power required the appearance of inevitability, the suggestion that current arrangements were as natural and permanent as the stone from which they were carved. Each grievance he spoke seemed to echo and fade, bouncing, off surfaces too hard to absorb its meaning, too polished to be marked by its passage. His words about grain that rotted reached ears accustomed to abundance. His concerns about roads that ended nowhere travelled to minds that had never walked further than their carriages could carry them. The gap between his experience and their understanding stretched across the throne room like an unbridgeable chasm. The light falling through high windows illuminated his figure, but somehow failed to reach the places where decisions were made. leaving the sources of power in shadows. That seemed appropriate to their function. Sunbeams carved golden paths through air, thick with incense and unspoken calculations, creating islands of brilliance that highlighted the performance while leaving the audience in comfortable darkness. His account of medicine priced beyond reach traveled to listeners whose physicians lived in their households, available at any hour for any ailment, their expertise purchased like any other convenience. His description of land stolen by legal fiction reached people who owned more territory than they could visit in a lifetime, vast holdings that existed primarily as numbers in account books rather than earth beneath their feet. The acoustics of the chamber had been designed by architects who understood that power required appropriate staging. Every word he spoke was perfectly audible, yet somehow seemed to lose substance as it traveled through air toward listeners who had trained themselves to hear without being affected, to listen without being moved. The sound carried beautifully, while the meaning seemed to dissipate like smoke in wind. Behind him, the great doors through which he had entered stood closed, their brass fittings gleaming like the eyes of watchers who missed nothing while understanding less. The doors separated this chamber from the world where his grievances were lived daily by thousands of citizens who would never see the inside of this marble theatre, never speak their truths to power that dressed itself in such magnificent distance from consequence.